Yeah.
And when those trees get ripped out, that carbon gets released. And that comes before we process this wood and ship it. We have all those emissions, and then we burn it and don't count those emissions. This is just, to me, it's an imponderable idea and an imponderable policy. And I was so torqued about this at COP26 in Glasgow a couple of years ago that I was at a press conference with the president of the COP, Alok Sharma. He was one of the speakers. And I stand up and I've got my mask on because it's during COVID, and I'm explaining my question about biomass and how can this possibly be carbon neutral. And he's looking at me through his mask like, dude, like this is settled. Like ask your question, but you're not going to get an answer from me. And I could just see his disdain for my question. And I said to him, do you want to fix this problem or not?
Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today's guest on the newscast is environmental reporter and longtime Mongabay contributor, Justin Catanoso. His years and decades of specialized reporting on the climate COPs and the wood pellet industry are well established at Mongabay. He joins us today to discuss his latest investigation into the UK biomass maker, Drax, which is seeking to establish 2 large wood pellet plants in the state of California to make 1 million tons of wood pellets to export annually to Japan and South Korea, where they will be burned in converted coal power plants. In this conversation with Rachel Donald, Justin unpacks why this isn't just a problem from an emissions standpoint, but also from a deforestation standpoint, loss of biodiversity standpoint, our ability to sequester carbon, and how nations are still getting away with counting this energy source as renewable energy. It's not an issue unique to Drax, California, Japan, or South Korea. Justin explains how this industry argues and advocates for itself, despite the fact that its purported benefits exacerbate the biodiversity and climate issues we are experiencing, and the tough hill to climb to achieve the political will to do anything about it. If you haven't yet dived into the issues surrounding the biomass industry, I highly recommend you start here.
Justin, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Rachel, thank you. I am glad to be back on the Mongabay podcast.
Now, you are probably the journalist in the world who's written most around Drax and this question of biomass. So let's presume that we're starting from a baseline knowledge of 0 for some listeners. What is biomass fuel? Why is it seen as renewable? And what are some of the problems that we're seeing come up already with it?
Okay, so very quickly, biomass fuel can be a lot of different things. So it can be ethanol, it can be switchgrass, it can be soy. But in the stories that I've been covering for Mongabay since 2018, and I've written scores of stories about this, it is forest biomass. It is the process of cutting down trees, shredding them, drying them, turning them into wood pellets, which are a little bit bigger than like a pill capsule, producing them by the megatons, primarily in the U.S. Southeast, and then shipping them overseas to the European Union and the United Kingdom to be burned in coal-fired power plant. Sometimes co-fired with coal, sometimes just the wood itself. The reason is because both of those entities are required by law to stop burning coal by 2030. By some fluke and I think honest mistake in the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, wood burning was classified as a renewable energy source on par with wind and solar, like 0 carbon. And the explanation was simple and it was sort of plausible. That is, you cut a tree and you burn it and you release all that carbon, but then you plant a tree and then all that carbon gets reabsorbed. And the thinking then was kind of like all that happened in the same day. Well, it takes decades and decades and decades for a tree to grow and to actually reach its potential to sequester a lot of carbon. And then when you cut it down and burn it, it all gets released in a day.
Mm-hmm.
But it is 50 to 100 years before that carbon gets reabsorbed. And so that's the problem. The carbon neutrality label, which is a policy consideration exclusively, it is scientifically based on my sources, based on the research that I've read, and there's a lot of it, is completely invalid. There's nothing carbon neutral about burning wood in the timeframes that we need, even if we are replanting the trees and letting them grow for 100 years, which in very few instances we're doing. So what's happening is we are cutting down our most efficient carbon sink, which are intact forests. And so we're losing that carbon sequestration capacity. And then we are processing them, we are shipping them, we're creating all kinds of emissions, and then they're being burned instead of coal. Those emissions are not being counted in the countries where they're burning them. This is why this is, a good deal for them, and which is why the policy exists. But there's so much evidence to suggest, Rachel, that this is like bad times 3, that we're creating more emissions when we burn wood than coal, and it makes sense because wood is less energy dense. So per unit of energy, we are making the problem worse at the smokestack and where the wood is being harvested. And that I am saying not as an individual, not as an environmental journalist, but as someone who has been studying this issue for the past 6 years and talking to experts around the world and on both sides of it. The people that run the biomass industry, the people that run the associations. I hear them explain what they say, and I listen to the other side, and it doesn't add up.
It really doesn't add up. So I've done a little bit of reporting on this as well, nowhere near the depth to which you have. But from the scientists that I've spoken to, not only is there the problem of like the time lag with regards to sequestration, but this idea that forests are renewable is completely lacking in an understanding, a systemic understanding of the role that our forests play with regards to, managing our global ecosystem services, biodiversity, and all of these kinds of things. But also, if you plant a tree and you rip it out, every time you do that, you are eroding the soil. Soil dies after a moment, especially if you are planting trees in monocultures, for example. We can't just, if you cut down a primary forest, you can't just recreate that primary forest in 100 years' time because that forest has taken eons to develop. I mean, what we're looking at, maybe you can speak to this, is often when primary forests are cut down and, for sustainable forestry, for example, what's replacing it is more akin to a monoculture than a primary forest, which is also going to add to soil erosion and loss in soil quality, which will eventually, in some cases, lead to, a dead state.
Yeah, I actually want to speak to that. And so I've seen this. So I live in North Carolina, and North Carolina has 4 large pellet mills. We probably produce more, as a region, North Carolina probably produces more pellets, certainly than anywhere else in the U.S. Southeast, but maybe anywhere else in the world.
North Carolina was home to 4 in vivo wood pellet plants, more than any other U.S. state. The company itself was the largest producer in the world. They filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in March 2024.
But I got to see this most dramatically in British Columbia a couple of years ago when I was reporting for Mongabay on the deforestation that is taking place in British Columbia, one of the most beautiful places on earth, sort of, in the northern latitudes. The deforestation there is taking place somewhat for wood pellets. Drax is a major producer of wood pellets in British Columbia, but primarily because the timber industry is so strong there. So I went out with an environmentalist who took me on this bumpy ride on the other side of the mountains, where you can't see how much devastation there is, how much clear cutting is going on. And we went to a clear cut, and I could see that trees were cut down. They were over 500 years old.
Oh, God.
And they were just cut down, and they're sawed up for all kinds of timber products, like maybe for shingles, maybe for wood products, maybe for furniture, maybe for guitars. Beautiful. Okay. But on our way back, I'm looking on either side of the road, and we're on a logging road. And so on the one side of the road, there's this diverse forest, and you can tell that it's diverse because it's a tangle and morass of vines and different kinds of trees, and there's light filtering in. And on the other side was completely dark. Completely dark. It's the middle of the day. It's sunny out. So I say to the guy who's driving, what is this over here? And he says, that's a hemlock farm. A what? A hemlock farm. I said, stop. And we stopped the truck and we walk into it. This was a hemlock farm where all these trees were planted about 50 to 60 years ago. They were all the same height. They were sort of spaced out. And so their canopy was completely grown together.
Of course.
There was no light coming through. There was no sound. We were in a wooded place. There were no insects. There were no birds. And on the ground, there were only a handful of sprigs of ferns. But that was it. It was a dead zone. And what we were in essentially was a farm. And those trees were going to be cut probably within the next 5 to 10 years because they had grown big enough for that all to be clear cut. Rachel, when I say clear cut, like it felt violent. If you've ever been like in 100-acre, 200-acre clear cut where every tree is knocked down and ripped out.
Yeah.
These are things that we do to collect these natural resources. We need these natural resources. We need wood products. Like there's no getting around that. The process of doing that in natural forests, so as you explained so eloquently, is devastating. And the soil, and it starts with the soil because so much of the carbon that's sequestered in a real forest is below ground. Yeah. And when those trees get ripped out, that carbon gets released. And that comes before we process this wood and ship it. We have all those emissions, and then we burn it and don't count those emissions. This is to me, it's an imponderable idea and an imponderable policy. And I want to have one more rant before we go on to your next question. And I was so torqued about this at COP26 in Glasgow a couple of years ago that I was at a press conference with the president of the COP, Alok Sharma. He was one of the speakers. And I stand up and I've got my mask on because it's during COVID and I'm explaining my question about biomass and how can this possibly be carbon neutral? And he's looking at me through his mask like, dude, like this is settled. Like ask your question, but you're not going to get an answer from me. And I could just see his disdain for my question. And I said to him, do you want to fix this problem or not? And I think the answer is not as much as people might think we should, because there's no slowing down. All the data suggests that there's only more and more demand for wood pellets, not just in the United States, not just in Europe, not just in the UK, but now in Asia.
Well, it's because the question becomes, what problem are we trying to solve? Are we trying to solve how do we live sustainably? How do we live well? Or are we trying to solve, the public seems to have figured it out about fossil fuels. So we're going to have to put a new fuel source in that will allow us to continue perpetuating this same economic model, but will just cause the same problems in a different location or in a slightly different place. I mean, and I think we should put some figures on it. And because it is mind-boggling how this accounting trick has become the backbone of policy in the United Kingdom and the European Union. Drax is the single biggest emitter of carbon dioxide in the United Kingdom. This biomass renewable energy firm is the single biggest emitter of carbon dioxide in the United Kingdom. It emits 20 million tons of CO2 annually, which are not counted on the nation's carbon budget because it is allegedly a renewable energy source. That is madness. I've got this line that I like to trot out, which is physics doesn't fall for accounting tricks. This is about balancing books rather than actually taking action, I would say, to solve the problem. Otherwise, we wouldn't be allowing the single biggest emitter of carbon dioxide to be off the country's books.
Now, can I just stop you for 1 second? Mm-hmm. On top of that, the UK is subsidizing this.
Yes, that was my next point.
To the tune of billions of pounds, but take it from there.
Yeah. So I've got figures in 2021, Drax got £893 million in subsidies, which was almost 50% of the entire £2 billion budget for biomass subsidies. £893 million. And then it doubled its profits. The following year. It's raking in so much public money, almost £1 billion in public money, to be the single biggest emitter of carbon dioxide emissions in the United Kingdom. It is mind-boggling how this is still going on. To me, it sounds like a scam. And what we're seeing is that it's now being sort of exported elsewhere. I mean, this was your most recent story that they are teaming up with Golden State Natural Resources in California to produce 2 of the biggest wood pellet mills in the United States.
Well, that's the plan. Now, they aren't quite the biggest because they are building and have plants in the deep south here in the United States, some are bigger and some are around the same size. So it's going to fit right in to the sort of the array of wood pellet mills that Drax has. Combined, Drax has 17 wood pellet mills in the United States and in British Columbia. The West Coast, and they're building a $250 million plant right now in Washington State. So they are expanding their West Coast production facility primarily to feed the Asian market. So the demand right now for wood pellets in Japan and South Korea, which is doing the same thing as the European Union and the United Kingdom, is shifting from coal to wood. And because they also have policies that call this a renewable energy source. Mm-hmm. So the demand for wood pellets in those Asian countries is increasing by 6% a year. They're already burning tons and tons and tons of wood pellets a year to generate energy. And again, these subsidies that you mentioned, there have been a handful of lawsuits. They don't go anywhere, but the advocates are saying, if you actually put that £1 billion into solar or wind or hydro or something else, we would be farther along and we would actually be impacting the climate crisis instead of making it worse. Not only with emissions we are counting, by the reductions day by day of the largest carbon sink in the United States, which is the southeastern United States.
Hey, just a quick note. If you're enjoying this podcast, we really appreciate it and your support of this show. We couldn't do the important deep dive audio reporting we're doing without you listening to it. If you're currently listening to us on your browser, like Google Chrome or others, we also really appreciate it, but highly recommend you subscribe to us through the podcast provider of your choice. That helps support our show further, raises its profile, and brings us to a wider audience. It's also the best way for you to stay up to date on new shows we release and catch up on previous episodes. And if you're looking for something else to do to help support us, share this podcast with a friend and spread the word about the Mongabay Newscast. Once again, we greatly appreciate the listeners who support our nonprofit audio journalism on some of the world's biggest environmental issues. Listeners like you help us keep doing this important work. So thank you. And now, back to the conversation.
I just wonder, though, when we think about the renewable energy economy, we think about solar and wind, certainly something that a lot of people say to me is that the supply chains for the rare earth metals and the minerals that we need are not dominated by Western powers. They're dominated typically by China, which is also the production house, essentially, of, your solar panels and your wind turbines. It is definitely way out ahead with regards to the renewable industrial revolution. Yet, our forests, that's a fuel source that is still available in certain territories, isn't it? It's in British Columbia. And interestingly, BBC Panorama exposed Drax for importing primary old growth forests rather than sawdust and waste wood, which it was claiming to from Canada. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if perhaps somebody said this to you, or maybe we can speak to it. The fact that, in a world that is increasingly resource scarce, the United States, Canada, you've still got a lot of your forests left. Europe doesn't, by the way, for anybody listening. It's completely out. But it has allies that has a lot of forest left.
So there's a lot of forest left in Eastern Europe. So Romania, Lithuania, Estonia, they are losing their forests, and they are one of the primary European producers of wood pellets. And they're really there have been the BBC, the New York Times, and others have done investigative reports that have just shown that they're taking down old growth trees. Right. Like hundreds of years old, ground them up into pellets. I want to put this into sort of the context of what is coming from the other side, because it's important to understand that they have an argument and they have science that they put out there and they have scientists that produce this work for them. And so basically what they are arguing is that we're only using residues. We're only using waste wood from timber mills, only using the stuff that's fallen on the ground. And so we're not really taking whole trees. Well, the BBC blew up that point of view with its investigation. I did it on my own a couple of years ago with the help of a whistleblower from inside the world's largest pellet maker when I went to the coast of North Carolina and saw a site that was being completely clear cut with half the wood going to Enviva. But basically the argument that they make is that forests are growing faster than the harvest is taking place.
That's absurd.
So and here's the thing that they're arguing. They're saying, because this is a global issue and a global concern, that if we have trees that are growing, if we're not harvesting in Western North Carolina and those forests are expanding, well, then we can take all the trees we want in Eastern North Carolina and that's all going to balance out.
Good gosh.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
okay.
So this is the argument that they make. Now, the big thing is that it's just residue. It's just residue. So we're not really even affecting trees that much. The clear cutting is really just going to timber mills. Not true. Some of it is. Oftentimes, the majority of it is. But in the absence of the demand for wood pellets, a lot of logging wouldn't be taking place. Mm-hmm. It's really filling this niche now because a lot of wood products industries have sort of fallen by the wayside. And the reason they're congregating in the Southeast is because we're not making as much paper, we're not making as much fluff, we're not making as much stuff that goes into diapers and other kinds of products. We're not making as much furniture. That stuff's being made overseas. So here comes the wood pellet industry to sort of save the logging industry. But this idea that forests are replenishing themselves at a faster rate than they're being cut down is sort of undermined by any kind of research that looks at the last 25 years. What they say is they go back like 75 years. So this is when the U.S. pretty much cut down every tree for the end of like the construction and development of the U.S. Well, yeah, we've grown back a lot of secondary and third growth forest in the last 75 years. And we've cut down a lot of it in the last 20. But if you go back 75 years, they can say, see, we've got a bigger canopy in the southeastern United States. And here's the thing. Enviva, Drax, most of these companies do not return my calls.
But
they will talk to a reporter that's doing this story for the first time, even if that reporter is working for the New York Times, because it's so complicated. It took me years to figure out what is happening here, because I hear what they're saying. That sort of makes sense. If you're not a forest economist, if you're not a forest mechanics person, you're like, well, it's just residue and the trees are growing back faster than they're being cut down. Rachel, if you stand outside a pellet mill in North Carolina, the trucks never stop running. Never. Maybe 6 hours in the middle of the night. 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. They are cutting down trees within a 50-mile radius of every plant. In California, if these plants, the 2 plants that Drax wants to build, where they intend to produce 1 million tons of pellets a year. There's a plant in the Sierra Nevadas in Central California, and another plant in Northern California that is going to have a 100-mile radius for harvest around these plants, where they will be producing wood pellets, and they're building a port near San Francisco, or looking to build a port near San Francisco, so they can send those millions of tons into the Asian market. The California forests have already been devastated by wildfires. And what the environmentalists say is we need to just let these forests regrow. And what the pellet industry and what Golden State Natural Resources is saying is, well, we're just going to take all that wood off the ground. We're going to grind it into wood pellets. We're going to go in and we're going to take the trees that aren't very healthy. And one of my sources with Biofuel Watch said that logic is akin to beating a burn victim.
Mm-hmm.
But the argument is so personal, and the fear around wildfires is so dramatic, and the ignorance to what the wood pellet industry really is environmentally is so widespread that people are like, wow, really? Like, we're going to get a pellet mill? You're going to create 75 jobs and pay us $15 an hour and some horrible work? And you're going to fix the wildfire threat? How many tax dollars can we give you so you'll get us that gift? And that's what they're aiming for.
It is astonishing to me that this is one of the logic leaps that has come out of the climate crisis and worsening climate events like wildfires. Or we'll just cut down the forests so as to avoid future fires. It is totally divorced from reason. It's scientifically unsound. If you look at the difference between how vulnerable old growth forests are versus, plantations or versus logged forests, it is totally different. And it speaks to, again, a policy perspective that is seeking to solve the short-term problem rather than understand the long-term incentives or drivers of this very, very, very complex crisis. And it is just astonishing to me that we've gotten to a stage where, devastating any more natural resources could be understood as a solution to this, when the problem is that we are decimating nature. And I also just want to frame this within, the news that we've seen this week, which is that the Los Angeles City Council has voted unanimously to stop any new oil and gas projects, and also have, existing oil and gas plants shut down within 20 years. That's excellent news, don't get me wrong. But just down the road, 2 huge wood pellet mills are going to be built in the Golden State, and it's this logic, and not even for the Golden State's own energy, which is a slightly different thing. But it's just this logic of like, it's a particular fuel source that is the problem, rather than our overconsumption of fuel or our denigration actually of the natural world around us.
So let me complicate this a little bit more for you.
Please.
Australia, not always on the right side of the climate emergency, is part of the G20. It's one of our developed nations, and the wood pellet industry does not have a foothold there.
They don't have any trees.
Well, they've lost a lot of their trees. But there's some trees, Rachel, and they're enough for the wood pellet industry to say, we have got to get into Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And about a year and a half ago, the parliament, which for the moment is more progressive than it is conservative, passed a law that is still in place today that says we will not be giving renewable energy credits for forest biomass.
Oh, amazing.
And as a result of that, Drac, Inviva, Granule, any of these big wood pellet companies is like, well, I guess, it doesn't make any sense. If we're not going to get subsidies, because this whole industry is completely dependent on subsidies. If the subsidies go away, the industry collapses. But the
fossil fuels.
Yeah, absolutely. But the incongruity is, how can we have one G20 country, Australia, saying burning wood is not a renewable energy source, and yet we have, 18 other countries saying, yeah, it is. And this speaks to the expediency. It speaks to the point that you just made about short-term solutions. So we're going to burn less coal, which is a good thing, but not when you're creating more emissions in the process of doing it and destroying ecosystems and taking down really the most effective carbon sink that we have, which is a tree in a biodiverse forest.
So, do we have any understanding of what's going on in Australia? Who's got their ear? Why do they understand this problem better than, the rest of the G20?
They don't. What they have there is a receptive government. They have a really well-organized anti-biomass movement there. And I've met those people because I've covered a bunch of UN climate summits. And I've met those people at these climate summits. And they're so well-organized in Australia. And they're also working to support the pushback against forest biomass in the UK and in the European Union. But here's the sole reason. There was no money at stake there. The forest biomass industry did not exist. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry here in the United States, as it is in Europe, as it is in Canada. So once once it becomes like an economic thing, just like the oil industry, then they have the ability to sort of buy the good graces of the politicians that are going to either go one way or another with their policy. And so they just didn't have a foothold, and they didn't have any political clout in Australia. So they managed to get a law passed before they could get in there and say, hey, we've got $2 billion invested in the country and we're employing 500 people. You can't shut us down.
Yeah. Yeah. How interesting. It also, I just want to go back a little bit to what you were saying about like the rate of growth of the forests and how, they were kind of it sort of plateaued, it got a little bit better, and now it's gone up again. I was at a conference recently and somebody said the most like controversial thing, which I loved because it sounds true. They said fossil fuels saved our forests. That if you look at the rate of deforestation before we discovered coal, I mean, we were on track to deforest the entire world so quickly. And the rate of deforestation only slowed and plateaued due to the discovery of coal.
I'm sure the Arctic ice sheet is delighted to hear that little bit of trivia. Oh, man.
Well, I think it's an interesting point that kind of speaks to, again, it's very dangerous to kind of anthropomorphize our fuel sources because it takes the pressure off and the responsibility off that, in fact, the problem is how we choose to economically organize ourselves. And I'm playing fast and loose with the term we there. And so it says, it doesn't matter what we substitute in. We have to have a better understanding of the complexity of how all of these systems, biosystems, ecosystems, everything work together and our role within these ecosystems as well. And the fact that, to go right back to the beginning, the fact that we're cutting down trees, the best sequesterer of carbon in order to burn them, which emits more than coal overall, and that not being counted as emitting anything and being considered a renewable energy source. It just speaks to that continuing fallibility of not understanding the complexity of the issue that we face and that maybe we just can't get away with doing what we want when we want.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, on the edges of all this is this idea that we're just going to plant trees. So how many initiatives do we have around the world? Like plant 1 million trees, plant 1 billion trees, plant 1 trillion trees. There are lots of problems with that because we are planting trees in places where they don't belong. Years ago for Mongabay, I reported from South Africa, and the African savanna is where our largest animals live. They don't live in forests. They don't live in jungles by and large. They live in open areas. And well, where do we have space to plant 1 trillion trees? In savannas and grasslands. Bad idea. Mm-hmm. We are not planting those trees. And when we do, as we discussed earlier, we are planting farms. And so there's a saying that I've heard, you can plant a tree, but you can't plant a forest.
Of course.
The other thing is this, and this is something that people don't understand, and the forest biomass industry leverages to great effect. And that is, a tree doesn't really start sequestering carbon at any kind of rate until it's at least 40 years old. This is one of the arguments that the biomass industry makes, is that new trees sequester carbon at a faster rate than mature trees. That is a true statement.
Oh, gosh.
But you got to think about this. This is how they make arguments that, again, unless you know what they're talking about or what they're covering up, you're fooled. Yes, new trees sequester carbon very quickly, and they sequester about a thimbleful. A mature tree that's 50 years old, 100 years old, is sequestering carbon very slowly, but it's sequestering it by the bucket. In its leaves, in its limbs, in its trunks, in its roots, and in all the soil around that.
Well, exactly.
And this is, again, these are the arguments that they make to policymakers that are looking for an out. And the out is, we stop burning coal. And they deserve some empathy in this, Rachel. I really think that it's somewhat an impossible situation. Our need for energy is growing and growing and growing. Our ability to replace that energy with renewable energy sources is just not up to being able to do it one for one. So they're saying, if you're not going to let us burn coal, then we got to burn something. until we figure out 20 years from now, 30 years from now, how we're going to stop burning wood. But by then, we're already past a lot of tipping points. By then, I don't know that we can really sort of do this sort of drawdown that they talk about to sort of cool the planet. It's just maddening by either geoengineering or other engineered methods that we hope to, or carbon capture, that we hope will forgive the sins of all this destruction that we're doing to our natural environments that we absolutely depend on for the prosperity that we have hundreds, thousands of miles away.
The great degrowth guy, Tim Parikh, who's been interviewed on this podcast, I interviewed him in January. He has this great line around, if you are heading towards, a cliff in an accelerating car, which is essentially, where we are with regards to the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, ocean crisis, all of the crises, why would you accelerate? And all of these policies are a form of acceleration in the hope that by the time we get to the cliff, we will have built it out essentially, or figured out an ejector seat technological solution or whatever.
Yeah.
And it is pure madness, but not in the sense, exactly as you said, not in the sense of people being bad or evil, but people really kind of running out of ideas, not knowing what else to do except keep doing the thing that we've always done. And it is going to take such a kind of revolution of creativity, innovation, collaboration, trust to turn the wheel around before we get to the edge of the cliff and slam on the brakes.
And the thing is, and I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, because we're in a true crisis, and things are going to get a lot worse, even if we were somehow magically able to stop burning fossil fuels and putting carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere today. We know what to do. We have the technology, and that technology is growing and innovating at a fairly fast pace. Problem is, as you use the very precise word of acceleration, climate change is accelerating faster than our progress. And in the absence of political will, which I witnessed the absence of in 6 of the 7 UN climate summits that I covered, the exception being Paris in 2015, is that we don't have the political will to do what is really necessary, to do what everybody at those conferences knows needs to be done. And by everybody, I just mean the 20 richest countries in the world, because they produce 80 to 90% of emissions. Everybody else is just a victim to it.
Yeah.
But that will isn't there. And sometimes it's not even a priority. I remember in 2018 when I was covering the climate summit that was in Bonn, Germany, and Angela Merkel shows up and she says, we made this pledge a couple of years ago in Paris to reduce our emissions at this rate and hit these targets. And, right now we have a rise in nationalism, and we have serious problems with immigration. It's blowing up our nation. It's causing all kinds of polarization and violence. And climate change is just not on our radar right now. So what do you say to Angela Merkel when she has like the Third Reich reemerging? Like, these are immediate things that they have to do now because the threat is now. And we all tend to think that, actually fewer of us, but too many policymakers are just like, well, we can get to this later. Well, it's now. It's now. Like, we are in the throes of a climate crisis. It's not down the road. I live in North Carolina. In a month, it's going to be too hot to go out during the day. Forget Florida. Like, people need to leave Florida in the summer because it's not going to go below 100 degrees after the sun goes down. In my area of North Carolina, which is the mid-Atlantic, we will have the climate of northern Florida in about 15 years. That's how fast our climate is changing here. And that's just one small example that I'm familiar with. It's upon us. And we are not pulling the levers fast enough to slow this down. And cutting down trees, calling it carbon neutral, that's just one of those loopholes that is just completely man-made. And as you said earlier, it only produces results on paper, and nature just doesn't care. She doesn't care what we think. She only responds to what we do. And right now, she is responding with a vengeance.
Justin, thank you so much for your time and for your reporting.
Rachel, thank you for having me on. This was fabulous. You had great questions. I appreciate it.
fantastic conversation with Justin on this subject. I really wish I could add a bunch of facts and figures, but I really didn't need to. Everything was super clear and clarified. It was a great discussion.
Yeah, it was so much fun to record. Drax is one of those things that not very many people talk about this particular problem, as he was kind of alluding to, right? Because you really need to know it. And there's actually a group of activists in the UK who are just focused on Drax because it's such a huge, huge problem, but they're quite small. And so when it was suggested that I interview him, I was like, oh God, yes, somebody to talk to about this in depth, because it is just astonishing what they're getting away with.
Yeah, this entire subject is something that I think it's one of those issues that I think flies under the radar way more than it should, precisely because of a few things that Justin highlighted, because it can be difficult for people to wrap their heads around, even if you've been looking into it for several weeks or months. It took Justin years to look into all the arguments of the industry and interview people on the other side and interview experts. I'm not saying it took him this long to understand what was going on, but to fully get the full picture of just how bad it is took that long. It's just, that to me was mind-blowing, hearing that.
Yeah, I think it's quite revealing of the fact that there are so many pieces of the machine in place to keep industry going, like PR, and marketing, and what are the industry lines, and even the fact that across industries they will often work together. There's a lot of information coming out about the fossil fuel industry, and has been for the last few years, about how the entire industry worked together in order to undermine science, undermine the IPCC, undermine policy, in the same way that the tobacco industry as a whole did as well. So journalists it's a real uphill struggle when you're an investigative journalist trying to figure out what's wrong with an industry, and hats off to him for staying the course. I was really moved by so much of what he said, including that bit where he was talking about, going to see the forests and that had become monocultures, and just how devastating that was.
Yeah, it was totally devastating. And to your point about, the importance of journalists' work, I thought it was really telling when he said that reporters from bigger outlets that have only been looking into this for a year will get their calls returned, but when he reaches out to them, they do not return his calls. I think that's very telling. I thought that was really indicative of the climate around this. It just shows the importance of not just reporting, but reporting consistently over years.
Mm-hmm. And also the importance of outlets like Mongabay, to be totally frank, because you can have, a young green reporter can get sent out on a beat, or just, somebody to cover a certain story or to look into it. But at Mongabay, we've got environmental journalists that have been honing, their area of expertise for years and years and years and years, and know what questions to ask, know what to look for, are connected into other environmental journalists that, and Mongabay is almost like a little university, essentially, of experts, in a sense, that whose job it is to write about what's going on in the world. And so I think I just want to throw that out there. We do a lot of episodes on this show, and rightly, about the importance of non-profit or environmental newsrooms. And I think this is another story which just goes to show how important that is.
Thanks for saying that, Rachel. And that's really important to highlight. And I really appreciate you bringing that to the table. That's really, thank you.
I love Mongabay.
There was something else in here that was mentioned. Just going to pull up my notes.
Take your time.
There's a lot I could mention here, but something that he talked about was, I don't want to misquote him. I think he said, he either said 5 out of 6 or 6 out of 7, but he said 5 out of 6 of the climate COPs I've covered, only one of them seemed to have the political will, and that was Paris. And he basically said the problem boiled down to the decisions made by the top 20 wealthiest countries. And to hear him lay that out just so succinctly like that, I wasn't shocked by what he was saying, but I was like, this is very cleanly and concisely spoken way of framing the political will problem that we have here. And I just wanted to highlight that and reiterate the importance of that point that he brought up.
Yeah, thank you for doing so. I'm seeing increasingly, like online, if I may, this kind of rhetoric coming to the fore, and rightly so, that we don't have almost like we've got a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis and all this kind of stuff, but we have a crisis of political will. We know what we should be doing. The science is very, very clear about what we should be doing. We know how to do it. It's just that there is an unwillingness or inability almost to take those necessary steps. And I think it's also important to point out that, okay, great that there was political will at one of those COPs. It actually didn't really translate into anything, did it? No, because we're well past 1.5 already. We're not going to meet the 1.5 target of the Paris Accord. And because none of these countries are willing to put it into international law. It's all agreements.
Yeah. And just to reiterate the context that Justin was talking about when he was saying that countries like Germany they're dealing with all these other factors, not to excuse what their logic by any means, but they're like saying, well, we're dealing with all these other crises. We're just going to get to this later. And he was saying, no, it's now. It's happening now. And there's no later.
We've got an election just around the corner in the United Kingdom, and you would be amazed at how low climate is on the agenda. Now, don't get me wrong, the United Kingdom is broken. It is a broken and poor developed country, and there are lots and lots of things that need fixed. And the material reality for most people is really, really bad here. Don't get me wrong, I know that. We have problems with our hospitals, we have problems with our police, we have problems with our education. We've got problems with all of it. But at the same time, there are people dying in India because of a 50.5 degrees Celsius heat wave. At the same time, we've got huge amounts of pollution in our rivers. At the same time, we are just seeing, the sweeping impacts of the climate crisis and huge warnings about drought and food scarcity in Europe. And it is so low on the agenda. And it's still just this like failure in the current political system that we have to see everything as interconnected and intersectional. And the only people that I see talking about it are, activists, mostly, some of whom are finally getting invited into the mainstream, and like maybe your occasional Green politician.
Mm-hmm. I also thought it was important that Justin pointed out the importance of understanding or empathizing with the viewpoint or the mindset of the people making the arguments in the industry. Not that you agree with it, of course, in order to look at it, examine it, and actually pick it apart truly. And I think that that's incredibly important to do, because someone who is not a journalist and who is not paid to do this work is probably not going to take the time to do that kind of examination on their own, especially if they don't have the time to or years to invest into it. So all that stuff, thought that was really important for him to highlight.
Yeah, definitely. We are reaching a point now, I think, with regards to the interconnecting crises, the real material impact of them, the time that we have left to enact change, whereby collaboration is the only route forward. And that means with everyone. And right. I think that can be quite a difficult pill to swallow. But I think increasingly people are coming around to this understanding that like most people are just trying to do what they think is best. And what some people think is best is absolutely awful. Just like objectively the worst decisions that you could be making. But they think it's best. And that's what's important. It's so important not to like categorize people into good and evil. Like we don't really have time for that anymore. Mm-hmm. If you want to build a better world, like empathy for those people as well has got to be a part of it, I think.
Right, for sure. Well, I am sort of out of thoughts. That's all I got for this one, Rachel. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about or highlight?
No, but I think that was really lovely where we went with that, because Justin and I think we're really thorough on the wood pellet renewable energy, sort of carbon accounting bit. So I think it's really nice where you and I just took that. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm looking forward to the next discussion on the next episode.
Yeah, me too.
If you want to read more on biomass or Justin's investigations for Mongabay, you can find links to his work in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay Newscast or any of our podcast content like our sister series Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, we really do encourage you to spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is definitely the best way to help expand our reach. But you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Mongabay is a nonprofit news outlet, and $1 per month makes a difference and helps us offset production costs. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast well over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. But you can also read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com or follow us on social media. Find us via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News and on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on our YouTube channel at Mongabay TV. Thank you, as always, for listening.